With the release of World of Warcraft Classic, I present to you Finkle's Lava Dredger. This is a scale replica of the two-handed mace found in the Molten Core raid. It's made out of solid maple, red oak, and it weighs in at 25 pounds. Why did I build this? Because it's my favorite weapon in World of Warcraft. And also it's completely insane. Now without further ado, let's see how I built this monster, and be sure to stick around to the end, where I summon the spirit of Gallagher himself. So this project is going to be made out of red oak and maple. The maple is going to be the gray parts and the red oak will be the red parts. This will all get stained later. The first step was to mill up these boards, which I got from pallets. Yes, actually some nice maple and oak hardwood pallets. I milled up, flattened both the front and back edges, and then on the table saw ripped the edges square. Then it was time to start gluing up this humongous gear end piece, which the piece of stock that needed gluing up ended up being 14 inches by 14 inches by 4 inches thick. So in order to glue up this massive block of wood and to maintain some kind of stability when it's all said and done, I wanted to crisscross the grains to kind of act as a giant chunk of plywood. This will really restrict wood movement and should keep things more concentric in the end. This glue up was by far the most stressful glue up of my life, and definitely used the most glue I've ever used. As you see, I had to employ this little roller I had purchased to spread out the glue evenly. This used about 1/8 of a gallon of glue, which was definitely overkill, and every single clamp I own. Because this giant chunk of wood has so much glue in it, so many glue joints, I decided to leave everything in the clamps for a good 24 hours just to make sure everything was rock solid. After all the clamps were removed, I could see that it needed some work with a chisel to remove some of the excess squeeze-out glue. Then I noticed that a lot of the glue had actually gone onto the table, and I figured I'd just scrape that off while I'm at it. Next, using my random orbit sander with 60 grit sandpaper, I can knock off the rest of the glue squeeze-out on both front and back faces. Next, over at my CNC machine, I run a code with my laser etcher to outline the shape of the main gear. I did this as I didn't really want to print out 4 pages of paper, try to line them up, glue it on, and then use that to cut out, as I found this was a much simpler option for me. With the outline of the gear now etched into the wood, it was over to my bandsaw to repeatedly struggle to make any cut in this extremely hard maple at 4 inches thick. My blade just wasn't appropriate for this. It was a 4 TPI half-inch blade, and actually, my machine was quite bogged down. It was even shaking at times. But this had to get done, and this was the only tool I could think of to use for it. Next, I could spend a lot of time over at the belt sander to knock off all those edges left by the bandsaw. Then over at the random orbit sander, I do the final pass cleanup to get rid of any last burn marks or any unpleasantness. Next, at the CNC, I can cut out 2 pieces of 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood to use as kind of bearing holders for the main body of the gear. These will get glued on to either side, hopefully directly in the center of the main gear, and this will allow it to spin. As you can see, the laser left a circle mark where this needs to be exactly located. Using glue and some brad nails, I keep it in place while I attach a deep reach C-clamp. Finding the placement for the other side bearing mount was a little more tricky, so what I did was I set up the bearing in the other side of the jaw, and using a square on either side, I kind of placed this temporarily inside the bearing and spun it around with a pencil over top to mark concentric circles in the middle. This gave me my exact location of the center of the other side. Before permanently affixing this to the gear, I needed to drill out the center for the shafting of the motor that's going to be turning this bad boy. And with that attached, we're done with the main gear of the mace. Now it's on to creating the handle over at the table saw lathe. Now I can cut up some 3 inch by 3 inch maple stock and drill holes on either end. 2 different sizes, one for the tailstock of the table saw lathe and one for the threaded rod that goes in the front to spin it. As you can see, this is my homemade table saw lathe, and it is very safe and it works amazingly, especially for just turning cylinders. If you need to do anything fancy, I recommend just using a regular lathe, but this is great for creating dowels, and you can see here I needed to create a 2 inch dowel as the main handle for this mace. Now, if you're interested in my table saw lathe, I do have 2 build videos going over how I built it and how I upgraded it to incorporate dust collection and a few other small changes. There will be a link in the description as well as a card up top you can click now. I cut this at about 2" 10 thou because I knew I was going to sand off about 10 thou worth of material, and this works great for sanding. You just rotate it with the drill and go through the grits, and you can see here I sanded off about 7 thou, which gave me a perfect fit with my 2" Forstner bit later. I first marked out the location of the grooves I wanted to cut into the handle, and over at my regular lathe I simply used a V-carve bit to just kind of put some shallow grooves in for some texture and depth. Now over at the chop saw I can cut the handle to final length, and the offcut piece is going to serve as the small piece that comes out the bottom of the handle to be glued in separately later. Next up I glue up 2 pieces of maple, which will become the kind of fake gear at the top of the handle. After the glue is dry and the clamps are finally off, I mark the center point of where the center of the circle is. Using an 1/8" bit I drill all the way through, and I use kind of a temporary compass to mark out the 5" circle that I need to next cut out at the bandsaw. And get ready, here comes a oh crap moment. So after I replaced the blade on my bandsaw, I finished up the cut and brought the circle over to the disc sander to flush up all the edges. I then cut up a template I created in CAD with a line drawn at every 10 degrees. So there's going to be 36 score marks around this faux gear edge. And then I'm going to screw it on to a board attached to my miter gauge, and I'm going to rotate this and run it through the blade every 10 degrees exactly where the line is. Now I can remove the fake gear from the miter gauge, and I can also remove the template, which turns out doesn't work very good by hand, but a heat gun works great. Then over to the strip sander, I can clean up all the inside edges, and after that I can go over to the drill press and drill out the 2" hole for that dowel to fit through we made earlier. Next up, I need to cut up some pieces of red oak to create the hexagonal hilt for the base of the handle. These pieces receive glue on one side and are thrown in the clamps for a few hours to dry up. In order to create the hexagon shape, over at the table saw, I have my blade set to 60 degrees. I am always trying to reference a 60-degree edge off the fence as I rotate it through. This will ensure that all the sides are the same and even. Once the hexagonal profile is complete, I can bring it to the chop saw and face off both ends and cut it to final length. Then I mark the center, and over at my drill press I pre-drill an 1/8" hole right in the center, and then I can use a 2" Forstner bit, drilling 2 holes in one end 3/4 deep, the other end 1.5 inches, as the 3/4 inch side doesn't really have much weightlifting to do, it just holds a little nub. Next I can cut up some previously milled red oak. These are going to create the jaws that I need to hold the gear and attach to the handle. One set of jaws is thicker than the other, as the one side will receive a cover plate to hide the motor and the battery assembly, which will get recessed in with a router later. After both glue-ups are removed from the clamps, I can run one side through the planer on a light pass, and then over at my CNC, I'm going to have it cut out the actual bearing slot, as I want this to be as accurate as possible. Also, I'm going to have it mark a center hole, and then trace the outline so I can later bring this over to the bandsaw and have a good reference line without having to do any layout or guesswork. In order to reduce the amount of sanding needed, I first cut out the front and backs on the miter saw as it leaves a cleaner edge. Then the long tapered sections were cut on the bandsaw and cleaned up on the disc sander. With the hole now drilled through the center, indicating the center of the bearing and where that hole is on the bearing holder on the main gear, I can now place the gearbox and motor assembly in place, trace it out along with the battery pack, and then I can start routing out these pieces in the thinner jaw. It's thinner because it's going to have that top cover to cover everything up and leave this accessible after the fact. I first drilled out all of the spots with a Forstner bit as to reduce strain on my router. When I was carving this out with the router, it really doesn't matter how terribly accurate it is. There's no need for any jigs or anything, as everything is going to be hidden in the end. It just needs to be big enough to house the components. Next up, using various thicknesses of scraps of red oak, I can glue up the piece, which will then get planed down to become the lid. I can then trace out the lid, and then over at the bandsaw, cut everything out to its rough shape and refine it over at the belt sander. I then clamp the two pieces together so they don't move while I drill 4 holes on the top, which will hold everything together. After that, I can drill the 2 lower holes, and these 6 screws will hold everything in place while maintaining accessibility to ever change out the batteries or motor. After the lid's affixed, I can bring it back over to the belt sander and trim everything flush with the base. In what looks like a sketchy operation, but I assure you isn't, I use my miter gauge set to the same angle as the headpiece and a stop block to stop it from moving, and cut both bevels on the ends of both headpieces. Next, I set in place a screw that's going to protrude up past into the lid where I know the location of the on-off switch is going to be for the battery pack, as I don't want to remove this back panel every time I just want to turn it on and off, only when I need to change batteries or something else needs maintenance. With this hole drilled, it's simple enough to use a pencil or a screwdriver to simply turn it on and off. Next, this block of red oak that was previously glued up can be marked out with the top jaw on what angles need to be cut off, as this is going to be the piece that connects the upper and lower jaw and also allows the handle to attach to the upper and lower jaw. I then use the corner to corner method to find the exact center, and using my 2-inch Forstner bit, I drill out a center hole, making sure not to go out the other side. Next, I can attach the jaw, which houses the motor and battery pack, via some clamps, and I'm going to be attaching this with 3 3-inch screws, as I want this to be removable in case I need to service the bearings or anything else. The other side will be glued permanently in place. Before gluing on the other side of the jaw, I need to go over to the drill press and drill out a 1-inch hole for the wind-up key bit to be created later. I then apply glue to one side, and using a spacer block on the front that's the exact width of the gear, I check the top and bottom with a square to make sure everything's good before firing in a couple of brad nails to hold everything in place, while 3 clamps let dry overnight. With the glue dried over at the belt sander, I can now flush up all 3 pieces to make one continuous part. To create the fake nuts which go on either side of the shaft where the big gear would be, I just simply run a CNC code to cut out 2 of the same shapes, smack them with a hammer to break the tabs, and bring them over to the disc and belt sander to just clean up the edges before they receive some stain. To create the wind-up key, I first take a 1-inch dowel over to the bandsaw and create a slot. This slot is going to house a rectangular shape piece of maple, which is going to have the layout of the heart shape of the key wind-up mechanism. Over at the spindle sander, I can give it a nicer profile, and then at the belt sander clean up the inside edges to ensure a nice fit between the maple. I can now bring the dowel over to the chop saw and cut it to length. Then on the piece of maple, lay out exactly where I want the Forstner bit holes drilled to create that heart shape. I can then cut out the shape on the bandsaw after marking everything out. I can then refine this over at the belt sander and work down to the line. After that, the last thing to do is to glue the heart-shaped piece onto the dowel, let dry, and then we're ready for stain. The gray stain went on very thick and was wiped off with a towel. The red stain went on very thick and just stayed on, as I wanted that red to be a little more brilliant. After the stain dried, it's time for final assembly. The first thing to do was to glue the plug into the base of the hexagonal hilt. Now flipping this piece around, I could put glue inside the other hole and drive in the actual handle. making sure to get which end correct, as the other side is a little longer between indication lines. I can then put some glue on the inside of the gear, slip that onto the handle, and then put some glue on the inside of the main head housing, and then slip that on as well, putting some glue also between the gear and the head. Next, I can attach the fake nuts to the top and bottom jaw with only a small amount of glue, and using an adjustable square, I can lay out exactly where these need to be placed. I can next apply some glue inside of the keyhole and put the wind-up key into that hole, making sure to make it look a little decorative and fancy on a 45-degree angle. Next, on the opposite jaw side of the wind-up key is just a small square that's supposed to kind of look like a metallic patch. This will then receive 4 screws in each corner. The last piece of decoration that needs to be added to this are 2 rectangles on the hexagonal hilt. This gets a small amount of glue in the middle and 4 screws in each corner. The finish I decided to put on this was a semi-gloss spray lacquer. I applied 3 coats over the course of about 6 hours. With the lacquer now dry, I can remove all the masking tape around the bearing housings and begin final assembly. After driving in the 3 3-inch screws that keep the jaw together, I can give it a quick test spin to see that it's moving freely. Now on to wiring up the motor and battery pack. You can see this uses 8 AA batteries, 1.5 volts each, equaling 12 volts, as is a 12 volt motor. This motor has a gearbox reduction to make it spin only at 20 RPM. I can then stand it up, flip the power switch and make sure it actually spins, then tuck the wires neatly inside and install the cover for final assembly.
I'll beat you.